I'm so fascinated by the topic we will discuss today, like consciousness. It just something that I was always wondering about. And the more I do research on this topic, the more different perspectives I would get. And then I will get lost at the end, like what's happening, like, because, with all those theories, like quantum entanglement, I think that, all particles are connected. If something happens to one, happens to another. Then if we don't observe something, it doesn't exist. And then what is the reality that we experience? Because I feel even if you and I, let's say, go to an event, you have one perception of what really happened there, and I'll have a completely different perception of that. And maybe you can help me better understand it, what consciousness is. And when we talk about consciousness, is it about collective consciousness or each person has their own?
Okay, let's thank you for inviting me on, by the way. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's my pleasure.
Let's take those things in reverse order. So by consciousness, I mean the simple fact that we are creatures that have subjective experiences. It feels like something to be me. It feels like something to be you. We're not just complicated objects. When I open my eyes in the morning, there's the experience of seeing the colors and shapes and objects that are out there. I don't just process information. And there's experiences of the world around us and of the self. Now, I have thoughts, I have emotions, I have beliefs, I have this experience of an object that is my body, experiences of free will, all these kinds of things. So that's the sense in which consciousness is both this very familiar thing. I mean, it's the most familiar thing. We all have direct acquaintance with being conscious, but it's also a fundamental and long-standing mystery, because conscious experiences don't seem to be the kinds of things that could be explained in terms of matter and physical stuff, whether it's quarks or atoms or chemicals or superstrings or entangled things, whatever it might be. There's this apparent explanatory gap between the world of the physical and the world of the mental that's been there in philosophy for thousands, well, hundreds at least, probably in some cultures, thousands of years. And it's still a challenge. And I think it's partly a challenge for science and also a challenge for philosophy. The way we think about these things, are we conceiving of consciousness in the right way? You mentioned like individual versus collective consciousness. So this is idea. Certainly our experiences are shaped by being in a context, in a social context. We're very social creatures. And part of the experience of being me is heavily dependent on how I perceive others perceiving me, which is my social context. But what I'm not, certainly in my own work, what I haven't been talking about is this idea that that consciousness itself is something that a group of people can have. There's some sort of, that in the sense that it feels like something to be, a crowd or a country. I mean, I don't think that's a thing. I think consciousness is something that is fundamentally individual, although the way it's expressed individually is very highly social. Anyone who's been in a crowd at a sports game or a music concert, we know this, right? We know that it feels like something to be part of the crowd. So that's the, and I think scientifically, for me, that's the place to start. What can we say about how consciousness happens and why it's the way it is for us individually? And then you also know it's true that it's different for each of us. We go to the same music concert and we might have very different experiences, not just in our, whether we like it or not, but we might actually experience the sound differently, see different colors there, and so on. And I think this difference, this diversity of our inner worlds is something that's really underappreciated. In fact, we've been doing a big study on this called the Perception Census, which reached about 40,000 people, and we haven't analyzed the data yet, but we want to kind of open the box on this and look in a much more broad way than's been done before about how we differ on the inside. We all know that we differ on the outside in skin color and height and so on. But I think differing on the inside has very important implications too in society.
By difference from the inside, do you mean like biologically, or how neurons, everything is connected, or there is something else behind it?
I think we definitely differ neurologically. I mean, there's so much variation, and I mean that's how biology works. The engine of evolution thrives on variation, and we can see this variation externally in height and skin color and body shape, and not to mention like things like ability to do various sports or whatever. We vary, and that variety is something that with my optimistic mindset, we're increasingly learning to value. And internally as well, our brains develop in conjunction with our bodies and the environments that we're in. And there's a lot of pruning and shaping of connections between neurons during our lifetimes, and especially in the early parts. And so that's going to create some variability too. So yes, we do differ in the very structure of our brains. And some of this may not matter at all. It may never be expressed in how we behave or how we experience things, but some of it might be. And it's that part that I'm interested in. So if you and I look at a color, do we see the same color? If you and I look at the sky on a day with loads of white fluffy clouds, do you see faces in these clouds where I don't? If we try and estimate how long a minute is, do I underestimate and do you overestimate? So I think there are all these fascinating differences that that we don't tend to appreciate, because it seems to us that our experience is this direct window onto reality. It seems to us that we see, hear, and feel things as they really are. And so if that's true, then why should anybody else feel, see, hear, think even differently? But they do, and they do.
I know that you say that the reality we perceive is hallucination controlled by our brain. But then the question is, how does our brain pick which areas to focus and how to interpret this data? How does it work?
How it works is, that's, I guess, why I'll still have a job, hopefully, in the next decades, because the brain is undoubtedly this complicated organism, complicated system. There are a number of theories about how it works in general, and they're probably all wrong. But the idea that I find very powerful is this idea of the brain as a prediction machine, and the content of perception, what we experience when we have a visual experience or hear something or feel something or touch something. All of these things I think of as, controlled hallucinations, which really means that they're internally generated, but they're like hallucinations in that sense. They're made up by the brain, but they're controlled. So they're controlled by the world, by the body, in terms of sensory signals. I think the key flip here, the key intuition, is that it seems as though we just read out the world from the outside in, as if the self is perched inside my head and it's just sort of peering out through the windows of the eyes. And it seems as though we read the world as it is. But the view that I've been working with for years now and decades is that, no, it's not like that. And the brain is always, it can't just read the world out as it is. It doesn't even make sense to do that. And colors don't exist out there in the world independently of a mind to co-author these colors. So the mind is continually making its best guess about what's there. The brain is really, the mind is what the brain does, I think. So the brain is making its best guess about what's there and using sensory signals to update this best guess and keep it tied, keep it calibrated to the world in ways that are useful for survival. And that's what shapes what part of the world that our brains are sensitive to, pay attention to. I mean, there's a sense in which the very structure of our visual systems selects part of objective reality. Our eyes are sensitive to just a few wavelengths of radiation rather than the whole electromagnetic spectrum. There's nothing we can do about that. So that's one sense in which evolution has shaped how we selectively sample reality. But then we also, in a more everyday sense, we pay attention. Like I can choose to listen to you, or I can choose to try and shift my visual attention to some other part of the room. That's a much more complicated process, and that's something that I think the brain is always doing this. It's always basically figuring out what is the most behaviorally relevant part of the world right now, and then that's what we pay attention to, and that's so our hallucination becomes much more controlled by that part of the world than by other parts of the world.
Then what controls our brain? Because it receives signals, right? What we need to focus on, as you said, you can look at me right now, or you can shift your attention to something else.
Yeah.
So is it consciousness that gives this signal to our brain, and then brain does it magic and we see the reality?
No, I don't think so. I think there's this intuition. It's very, very hard to shake. Possibly impossible to shake, actually, fully, which is that consciousness is this separate, immaterial thing that has this weird, semi-magical relationship with this mess of neurons inside our head that is the recipient of information from the world and then exerts control on the body and the world as well. Now, I don't think this is the right way to think. If you think about really simple creatures that maybe don't have rich conscious experiences at all, or maybe no conscious experiences, yet their brains still help them, guide them in the environments they're in. An ant is still able to navigate home. Don't know whether an ant has conscious experiences, but it's certainly an open question. So you don't need consciousness, and a lot of what we do is under the radar of consciousness as well. I think a lot of things that are just our brain, they come into our consciousness only later, after the fact, when the brain's trying to figure out, why did I do that? Why did I move my hand there? It's like, oh, there's a reason. So what controls the brain? Well, the brain controls the brain, and the world and the body control the brain. I mean, we are kind of in hoc to our environments in some way, but the great thing, or one of the great things about the human brain and other animal brains, mammalian brains, is it gives us an enormous amount of flexibility. So we can respond to the environment in many different ways. And I have this mug of tea. I can choose to drink it or not drink it, or pour it over something, or I don't know, put some sugar. I can do many things with the affordances of my environment based on what the long-term survival prospects might be. So there's huge flexibility, and when the brain is figuring out how to exploit that flexibility, that is what we experience as something like control, as something like agency or will or volition or intention. But these are just, in my view, these are just the sort of perceptual flip sides of something that the brain is just doing, in the same way that red colors in the world are very useful for the brain to experience, but they don't really exist as colors. The world is not painted in red in the same way that we experience it in our minds. So I think free will is pretty much the same thing. It doesn't exist as this causal power that's separate from the brain, but it's still a useful thing for us to experience, because it marks those occasions when the brain is sort of exploiting its flexibility.
It reminded me of a memory from my childhood. I was, I don't know, like maybe 4 or 3 years old. And every time my mom would tell me like, oh, like this is red, like red car. And I would look at her like, who even decided that this color is red? Maybe it's blue. She's like, no, everyone knows it's red. So it's red. And you're telling me like, not so fast.
Yeah,
We
not
may
so
see it
bad.
differently, yeah. But then, like, I'm curious about people with mental disorders, especially the ones like, you can see on the streets, especially in New York City, like people walk around talking to themselves. They see this reality others cannot perceive. Then their reality is as real as ours. How is it different?
I mean, it can be. It varies. So, in cases of mental illness, I mean, this is why I think the word hallucination, you have to be very careful with it. I think it's useful in the sense that when you apply it to people without mental illness, it's useful because it emphasizes that the way we experience things is still a construction. It's still something that the brain is generating, though it's in a way that's functional, that's useful. And when people start experiencing things that are really different from the norm, experiencing voices that aren't there and so on, that's when we typically call hallucination. But you can think of that as uncontrolled. Now the experiences have lost their grip. The brain's predictions in these cases has lost grip on their causes in the world and the body. So there is a real distinction, a very important distinction between perception in people who are, you might say, broadly neurotypical, not having vivid hallucinations, and people who are experiencing psychosis or some other illnesses like Parkinson's disease. Other things can give people hallucinations as well. It's the same basic process, but when the brain's predictions go awry and lose their grip on their causes, well, then the resulting experiences start to diverge much more strongly, much more to a much greater extent. And of course, that can become problematic, because if people do start seeing things that really aren't there at all, then that can mean they start behaving differently, and voices in the head can be, it depends on what they're saying, of course. I mean, there's a lot of stigma about these kinds of things, but it turns out that a lot of people experience voices in their heads. And for many of these people, these voices are really quite benign and unproblematic, but people are often quite reluctant to talk about them because they worry that they'll be called insane, which is a very archaic term for this kind of thing.
So in this case, their brain cannot control the reality. But then when we have dreams, we also cannot control what we see. So then, speaking about dreams, what are they? Are they like a different level of their reality we experience usually, or it's completely different?
I mean, they're fascinating, aren't they, dreams? I mean, I think, and people have tried to interpret dreams for centuries, way before Freud tried to do it, of course. And you're right. I mean, we have, again, vivid experiences when we're dreaming, but now there's pretty much no sensory input from the world. Yes, we hear things a little bit, and maybe some light gets through the eyelids and so on, but it's not so much. Yet we experience these vivid worlds. It is still a bit of a mystery how and why we dream, but there are some clues. One clue is that dream experience is typically different from normal waking experience in several ways. We don't have often the same sense of agency over our actions. Things change without us realizing that that's strange. Your location can change completely, or people can change identities. And normally you don't even notice this in a dream. There's this kind of lack of reflective insight into what's happening in the dream world. And so it seems rather that what's really vivid are more basic perceptual experiences, vision, emotional responses, these kinds of things. And I think a really nice idea about dreams comes from another neuroscientist and author, Eric Howell, and others, which is that dreaming is a bit like the perceptual machinery of your brain tuning itself up after a busy day. It's kind of free running. It's getting rid of all the sort of associations that may have been made during the day that don't really underpin its best model of reality. Like in AI and machine learning, if you're trying to train a statistical model, if you overtrain it on data, it doesn't generalize well to new situations. You need to like prune the connections that are not that are more contingent, that don't really matter. And dreams might be a way of doing that, sort of reducing the complexity of the brain's model of the world. But it's a big open question. I don't know really what dreams are for. They're probably for more than one thing.
Yeah, because I hear people saying like, oh, I saw it in my dream like a year ago, and then it happened in my life, or an experience similar to what I saw in my dreams. Then like I, for instance, remember almost all of my dreams.
Mm.
Then I know people, they say like after they wake up in a few minutes, it's gone. Like I remember maybe like 60% of the dream. I know like exactly what happened. I don't remember all the details, but the prevailing theme is there,
Mm-hmm.
which is like interesting.
That's
Apparently,
very
it's not for
interesting.
many
Yeah.
people.
I mean, I'm slightly envious, really. I'm among I think the majority of people who tend not to remember dreams. I have a little notebook by my bed, which I try to write down my dream in as soon as I wake up, because as soon as I wake up, it feels very vivid and it feels like I'll never forget that. It's just, of course, why would I forget? But yeah, a minute, 2 minutes later, unless I've written something down, it is just gone. And all I'm left with is this fleeting impression of significance. And in a sense, it's understandable why people forget dreams. If we had perfect memory of dreams, and I don't know if this applies to you because you probably can distinguish between memories that were from a dream and memories that were not.
Yeah.
You can see that might be a problem, right? If my dreams were very, very memorable all the time, then I would have a problem. It'd be like, did this happen, or did this happen in a dream? Whereas if you forget your dreams, you don't have that problem. If I remember something, it's probably because it happened.
Exactly. But then, I don't know, like, I'm just curious, like, as you said, right? You wake up and then you have your diary, notebook, you write down things from your dreams. And then what do you do with this? Is it because you think there is some answers in the dream state that you can apply in your daily life, or you're just curious?
I think it's fundamentally curiosity. I mean, I think that's the essential spirit of science anyway. It's certainly what's driven me, this curiosity about consciousness and all its manifestations, and dreaming is one of those. So yeah, I mean, I want to know what's going on in my brain and mind in these times. There's also the possibility that I might discover something useful. Sometimes I wake up and I feel like I've had a good idea that was so obvious I would obviously not forget it, but then I forget it. So I've only once, I think, had an idea about my work in a dream and then remembered it long enough to write it down. And it was not a major idea. It wasn't like, discovering. There's been some great historical examples of solutions to big problems coming in dreams. The sort of structure of the benzene ring is one of them that I remember. It wasn't anything like that, but it was still not a bad little idea. I've forgotten what it was now, but I think this happened. Most of the time, it's not like that, though. But I do want to also train myself to lucid dream. This is another state. I don't know if can you do this. Is when you know that you're dreaming while you're dreaming.
Yeah, it happens, like, especially when I see a dream and I don't like what's happening there. For a second, I have that moment like, oh, I'm just sleeping.
Yeah.
So it's not real.
Yeah. That's an example of lucid dreaming, where you regain this reflective insight into the fact that you're dreaming. And once you can do that, and you're much farther along than I am, then you open the possibility of being able to alter your dreams, maybe change if something bad is happening, change the situation. some people also just have fun in lucid dreams, go flying around, things like that. But a first step to learn to lucid dream is to be able to remember your dreams. So that's another reason I'm trying to do it, but it's a long and difficult process.
How does hypnosis play into all of this? Because especially these days, so many people, they really go deeper and deeper into personal development work and different modalities. But with hypnosis, I think like it's so connected to how we perceive the world, but also like how the brain works.
Yeah.
Like, is there any research that actually supports that by doing this practice we can change the reality we see for ourselves or change who we are?
Yes, but it's not necessarily to do with hypnosis. Now, hypnosis is one of these words that has a lot of baggage, going back to the 19th century and people waving magnetic rods over people, trying to change their thoughts in various ways. And there's this trope of a hypnotic trance, somebody waving a watch in front of your face and then you go into this semi-zombie state. I think this is all unfortunate baggage. At my university, my colleagues Zoltan Dienes and Peter Lush have been trying to use basically a different word to get away from all this baggage. And it's a very long-winded word. They call it phenomenological control, which basically is very long. But it basically just means that people have different abilities or their brains have different capabilities to change their experience of the world and the self. Now, we've already been talking about how even when I see something like color, this isn't just a transparent experience of objective reality. The brain is bringing a lot to the table. And people vary in how much the brain brings to the table in these experiences, how sensitive we are to context. So I think this is the useful new interpretation of hypnosis. It's not so much a state, let alone a trance state, but it's something that's relatively stable. Like, I don't know, like a personality trait, or even a physiological trait like height or something like that. And people who are higher in this trait of hypnotizability, it's easier for them to change their experiences based on their context. But it's something that characterizes us all. We're all hypnotizable to a greater or lesser extent. And by the way, it doesn't correlate with the things that you think it might. It doesn't correlate with IQ or anything like this. It seems to be a fairly independent thing, and it's neither a good thing nor a bad thing. It's another aspect of what we were talking earlier about, how our minds are all different in various ways. And I think this is one of the key dimensions. But when it comes to sort of changing how we experience the world and the self, I think probably one of the most two powerful ways of doing this. One is meditation, and meditation is very different from hypnosis. In hypnosis, you tend to not be aware of the fact that your brain is generating experiences. But in meditation, you often become more aware of that fact. It's about paying attention to the process of paying attention. But by doing that, we can often reshape not maybe how we see a color, but how caught up we are in the flow of experiences. We can give ourselves a little bit of distance to work with, and that can be extremely powerful.
I started meditating like 5-6 years ago, and I do it every day. Like I used to do TM, Transcendental Meditation. Then now I switch between TM and Joe Dispenza. I don't know if you're familiar with his work, but I do it like every single morning, like 20 to 30 minutes. And I can tell the person I was like 6-7 years ago, how I react to the events in my life, and in general, how I show up in this world is quite different than the person before starting meditating. But before I was like, meditation, how is it going to help me? Like in general, you're just sitting over there in silence or listening to someone saying something, and then 20 minutes later, you still have to go and live your life and probably make the same decisions, go to the same places, I didn't see any benefit. But now I can definitely tell that it's not always easy to meditate, because you
Mm.
have to sit with yourselves, and then you have those thoughts and you're like, oh, like it's not working, but actually it does. But you have to be consistent.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm glad it's working. Again, I think you're doing much better than I am in the discipline required, both for remembering dreams and now also for meditating. I mean, I've also meditated for many years, but not with any great regularity or self-discipline. Um, but it it is good to hear, and your story is very typical of people who have applied this discipline. Firstly, it's really hard. I mean, this is one reason I'm not very good at it. I find it very hard to sit with my own thoughts for any length of time and just let them be,
Mhm.
without grasping or even without evaluating. I think one of the things in meditation that you can easily fall into is this idea of like, oh, I'm not doing it right. I'm not doing it right. And it sort of having it as a goal, setting yourself specific goals, which is sort of the antithesis of a lot of meditative practice, which I'm most familiar with the Vipassana tradition,
Oh
which
yeah.
is much more about just noticing things, noticing what your attention is doing, noticing what thoughts are coming. And yes, I think this can be really transformational. Um, and I probably should dedicate more time to it, because it does take practice. You have to really, I think, automate
Hmm.
the habits of meditation in order for them to bed in. And the payoff is it's a long game, right? You're absolutely right that, I think to begin with, you can meditate for 20 minutes and then it's easy to feel you've just lost 20 minutes of a busy day.
Yeah, especially when you do TM, you're supposed to do 20 minutes twice a day.
Mm.
And then you feel like 40 minutes out of my day, but then it's okay to watch Netflix for 40 minutes.
And have you ever done a retreat where you've meditated for days on end for many hours each day?
No, but I know a few of my friends, they did this 10 days silent retreat, like Vipassana, right? Or
Mhm.
something different. And the experience was profound for them.
Mm.
I personally, I cannot imagine myself like for 10 days being completely still and silent. Maybe one day, because I'm really curious. I just don't think I can do it. Have
Mm.
you done any
I
of
Not
those?
for 10 days. I've been on uh, a 3-day retreat, which was mainly but not entirely silent
Hmm.
and involved walking as well, walking meditation. So we weren't just sitting there for 3 days, but it was 3 days of many hours of meditation per day. This was in Korea a number of years ago. And I did find it challenging. In fact, I remember that I think by the end of the 3 days, I was beginning to acclimatize a bit and
Mm.
was both relieved when it was over, but also slightly thinking that missed an opportunity to actually get into this properly. And if it had been another few days, that would be very, very transformational. But I didn't. I left.
I feel like with everything that we do, especially for the first time, it's a lot of resistance. We feel that it's not working, it's difficult. But then if we kind of push through this feeling for a few days, then, oh, it doesn't seem that difficult. It's not that complicated. I can do it. It feels like our brains just adjust to a new environment, which is fascinating.
Yeah, I think this is a basic principle of how biological nervous systems, brains work. I mean, we know this in very simple situations. Like we walk into a dark room from a sunny day and everything seems pitch dark, but then our vision adapts. We find a new baseline, we become a bit more sensitive to low light levels. Same with sound. And I think that principle just applies across the board. We adapt to major life transitions as well. And if something happens that's really good or really bad, and yes, overall quality of life might change, but it usually doesn't change as much as you think it would. You adapt to the new baseline, and experience is dominated largely by variations around that baseline.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed our conversation, and I wish one day, I don't know, like I can come and visit you at the university and see all the great research that you do in this area, because I think like our brains, consciousness is like one of those topics we'll probably never get a like 100% answer, but with every discovery, there's always something so fascinating. And again, like I absolutely love this topic. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And just by the way, that's a really important thing to say, because with consciousness, there's this view that it's just this enormous mystery and we'll never solve it. And that may be true, but what's also true is that even incremental progress is still really important, and we still learn many things about ourselves and our relationship to others and to the world. And so that's, for me, that's what keeps me going, is that I don't have to solve the big mystery in order for it to be really worthwhile. But yes, thank you very much.